On March 3, 1987, a filing clerk in the Municipal Records Department of Chişinău discovered that apartment 14B at 23 Strada Mihai Eminescu no longer had a primary leaseholder on file. The secondary occupant, listed as Vera Costin, age 64, had died 16 months earlier. The apartment had been flagged for reassignment, but the flag had gone unprocessed. When the clerk pulled the full file to resolve the administrative inconsistency, she found a handwritten note paperclipped to the inside cover. Occupant status verify through ministry channels before standard processing. The note was undated. There was no signature, only initials she couldn't decipher. She made a photocopy of the note and sent it to her supervisor with a request for guidance. The supervisor, who had worked in the records department since 1979, recognized the phrasing. Ministry channels meant the file had been touched by state security at some point. That meant the apartment couldn't be reassigned through normal procedures. It would need to be cleared. The supervisor submitted a request to the Ministry of Internal Affairs asking whether apartment 14B was still under any form of restriction. The response came back 6 weeks later. No active file. Proceed with standard reassignment protocol. On May 19, 1987, a housing inspector named Andrei Lupescu was sent to evaluate the apartment's condition. When he arrived, he found the door locked, but the building superintendent had a key. The superintendent, an elderly man who'd worked in the building since it was constructed in 1973, unlocked the door and stepped aside. The apartment had not been occupied in at least a year, possibly longer. The air was stale. Dust covered every surface. The furniture remained in place, a narrow bed in one room, a table and 2 chairs in the kitchen, a single bookshelf in the main room. The books were still on the shelf, Russian classics, mostly some technical manuals. There was a photograph on the kitchen table face down. Lupescu picked it up. It showed a young woman, perhaps in her early 30s, standing in front of a building he didn't recognize. The photo was black and white, slightly faded. He set it down and completed his inspection. The apartment was structurally sound, plumbing functional, electrical wiring intact. No damage beyond normal wear. He noted all of this in his report and submitted it the following day. The apartment was added to the reassignment list. 3 weeks later, a family of 4 moved in. By then, the photograph had been removed along with the other personal effects. They were disposed of according to standard procedure. No one kept records of what was thrown away. Understanding how the apartment became vacant requires going back 5 years, to the winter of 1982. Ioana Dumitrescu was a quality control inspector at the Chişinău textile mill, a sprawling industrial facility on the southern edge of the city that employed over 4,000 workers. She had worked there since 1976, after completing a technical certificate at the city's Industrial Training Institute. Her job involved inspecting fabric as it came off the production line, checking for defects, ensuring that the material met the specifications outlined in the state production quotas. It was repetitive work. The factory operated in shifts and Ioana worked the day shift, 6 a.m. to 2 p.m., 6 days a week. The factory floor was loud machinery running constantly, steam hissing from the dyeing vats, workers shouting to be heard over the noise. Ioana worked at a station near the end of the line where bolts of finished fabric were rolled and tagged for shipping. She kept a clipboard with her inspection forms and marked defects with small fabric tags that indicated what needed to be corrected. She was 33 years old in 1982. Unmarried, which was unusual but not unheard of for a woman her age. She lived alone in apartment 14B with her mother, Vera, who had moved in with her in 1980. After developing complications from diabetes that made independent living difficult. Vera was a retired seamstress. She'd worked for 30 years in a garment factory before her health declined. She was quiet, deeply religious in a way that made her uncomfortable in the officially atheist state, and spent most of her time at home reading or knitting. Ioana's colleagues described her as competent and unassuming. She wasn't particularly social, didn't attend factory social events, rarely joined her co-workers for tea during breaks, but she wasn't hostile either. She simply kept to herself. Several women who worked near her station said she was polite when spoken to, but never initiated conversation. Her supervisor during this period was a man named Constantin Grigor, who had been promoted to floor supervisor in 1980. Grigor was in his mid-40s, a party member since 1968, and took his responsibilities seriously. He believed in order, efficiency, and the importance of meeting production targets. He kept meticulous records of each inspector's performance defect rates, inspection times, compliance with protocols. Ioana's records were unremarkable. She met her quotas. Her defect identification rate was average. There was nothing in her file that suggested any problem. But in January of 1982, something changed. It began with a conversation in the factory cafeteria. Ioana had gone to eat lunch. She usually brought food from home. A piece of bread and some vegetables and sat at one of the long tables near the back. At the same table, several rows down, a group of women were discussing a new regulation that had been announced the previous week. The regulation concerned documentation requirements for workers who needed medical leave. The process had been simplified, they said, which meant less paperwork and faster approvals. One of the women said she'd heard the change was because too many workers had been abusing the old system, claiming illness when they weren't actually sick. Another disagreed, saying the change was because the old system was inefficient, that the bureaucracy had become too slow. Ioana, who had been listening without participating, said something. The women who were there don't agree on exactly what she said. One recalled her saying that efficiency wasn't the problem, that the system worked fine when people were actually sick. Another remembered her saying something about how the factory prioritized production over worker health, that speed mattered more than whether people were genuinely ill. What everyone agrees on is that she said it quietly, almost to herself, and that the conversation moved on. No one argued with her. No one seemed particularly bothered. It was a passing comment, the kind of thing people said in moments of frustration, except someone reported it. The report was filed by a woman named Lydia Sava, who worked as a machine operator on the same floor as Ioana. Sava was not at the table during the conversation. She heard about it secondhand from another worker, who mentioned it in passing while they were cleaning their stations at the end of the shift. Sava had been employed at the factory since 1974. She was a party member, appointed to her position on the factory's trade union committee in 1979. Part of her role involved monitoring workplace morale and reporting any concerns to management. The factory's administration encouraged this. Workers were told that reporting irregularities was a civic responsibility, that it helped maintain a productive and ideologically sound work environment. On January 18, 1982, Sava submitted a written report to the factory's administrative office. The report was brief. She noted that she'd been informed by a reliable source that Ioana Dumitrescu had made disparaging remarks about factory policy in the cafeteria. She described the remarks as critical of production priorities and potentially disruptive to worker morale. She recommended that the matter be reviewed. The report went to Constantin Grigor, Ioana's direct supervisor. Grigor read it, noted the date, and added it to Ioana's personnel file. He did not speak to Ioana about it. That wasn't the protocol. When reports like this were filed, the procedure was to document them and monitor the individual for additional concerns. A single comment, overheard and reported secondhand, didn't warrant immediate action, but it warranted observation. Over the next 3 months, Grigor paid closer attention to Ioana's behavior. He reviewed her inspection logs more carefully. He noted her arrival and departure times. He asked other workers about her attitude, whether she'd made any other comments that might be considered problematic. No one reported anything significant. Ioana came to work on time, completed her inspections, left at the end of her shift. She spoke when spoken to, but remained largely withdrawn. If anything, she seemed quieter than before. Grigor noted all of this in his records. Under normal circumstances, the matter would have ended there. A single incident, no pattern of behavior, no disruption to production. The report would have remained in the file, unread and forgotten. But in April of 1982, something else happened. The factory received a directive from the Ministry of Light Industry requiring all production facilities to conduct mandatory ideological education sessions for workers. The sessions were scheduled for Saturday afternoons twice a month, and attendance was compulsory. The content of the sessions involved readings from party documents, discussions of production goals, and reinforcement of socialist principles. The first session was held on April 10, 1982. Approximately 200 workers attended, including Ioana. The session was led by a party instructor from the regional committee, a man who delivered a prepared lecture about the importance of labor discipline and the workers' role in building a socialist society. After the lecture, attendees were divided into smaller groups for discussion. Each group was assigned a facilitator, usually a senior worker or trade union representative. Ioana's group was facilitated by Lydia Sava. The discussion prompt was straightforward. How can we, as workers, contribute to the advancement of our socialist society? Participants were expected to offer responses that aligned with party ideology statements about fulfilling production quotas, supporting collective goals, demonstrating loyalty to the state. Most participants gave predictable answers. One man said he contributed by arriving to work early and staying late when needed. A woman said she contributed by encouraging her colleagues to meet their targets. Others offered similar responses. When it was Ioana's turn, she didn't answer immediately. According to two people in the group, she sat quietly for several seconds, then said, "I'm not sure we can answer that honestly in this setting." Sava asked her to clarify. Ioana said that the question assumed everyone agreed on what advancement meant and what socialism required. She said that for some people, contributing might mean different things than what was outlined in official directives. She said she didn't know if she could give an answer that was both honest and acceptable. Sava asked if she was refusing to participate. Ioana said no, she was just uncertain how to respond. Then she said nothing else for the rest of the session. Sava filed another report that evening. This one was more detailed. She noted that Ioana had questioned the premise of the discussion, that she had implied a disconnect between official ideology and personal belief, and that her refusal to engage further suggested a lack of commitment to socialist principles. She recommended that Ioana be referred to the factory's internal party committee for review. The report was forwarded to Grigor, who added it to Ioana's file. He now had 2 documented incidents. Both involved statements that could be interpreted as ideologically questionable. Neither was explicitly criminal, but together they suggested a pattern. On April 23, 1982, Grigor submitted a summary report to the factory's party secretary, recommending that Ioana Dumitrescu be placed under workplace observation and referred to the Ministry of Internal Affairs for background review. The Ministry of Internal Affairs maintained files on thousands of individuals, most of whom were never investigated or charged with any crime. The files existed as a precaution, a way of tracking people whose behavior or statements suggested potential ideological unreliability. Being placed in a file didn't mean arrest. It meant documentation. Ioana's file was opened on May 6, 1982. It was assigned the number 1147D and stored in the Regional Directorate's Records Archive. The file contained the reports from the factory, Grigor's summary, and a brief biographical profile compiled from employment records and housing registration documents. The profile noted that Ioana was unmarried, that she lived with her elderly mother, that she had no children, no party affiliation, no history of political activism. It also noted that she attended church irregularly, based on observations recorded by a housing supervisor in 1980. Church attendance wasn't illegal, but it was documented. It suggested someone who maintained private beliefs inconsistent with official atheism. The file was reviewed by an officer named Pavel Cretu, who worked in the ministry's second department, which handled domestic monitoring and counterintelligence. Cretu had been with the ministry since 1975. He processed dozens of files each month, most of which led nowhere. His job was to determine whether an individual warranted active surveillance or could be left under passive observation. He flagged Ioana's file for passive observation, which meant periodic check-ins with her workplace and housing authorities, but no direct surveillance. He noted that the case involved ideological concerns rather than security threats, which meant it would be monitored but not prioritized. The file remained open but inactive for the next 8 months. In December of 1982, Iona's mother, Vera, was hospitalized with complications from her diabetes. She spent 3 weeks in the hospital before being discharged in early January of 1983. Ioana took medical leave from the factory to care for her, submitting the required documentation and receiving approval from her supervisor. During this period, a new regulation was implemented at the factory. All workers who took medical leave exceeding 2 weeks were required to submit to a workplace evaluation upon their return. The evaluation involved an interview with the factory's party committee to ensure that extended absences had not resulted in ideological drift or exposure to inappropriate influences. Ioana's evaluation was scheduled for February 14, 1983. She attended as required. The interview was conducted by 3 members of the factory's party committee, including Lydia Sava. The questions were standard. They asked about her mother's health, whether she planned to take additional leave, whether she felt capable of resuming her full duties. Ioana answered straightforwardly. She said her mother's condition had stabilized, that she didn't anticipate needing further leave, and that she was ready to return to work. Then Sava asked a different question. She asked whether Ioana had attended church during her leave. Ioana paused. Then she said yes, she had attended twice. Her mother had asked her to go, and she'd accompanied her. Sava asked if Ioana herself was religious. Ioana said she didn't know how to answer that. She said she'd been raised religious, that her mother was deeply religious, but that she didn't attend services regularly and didn't consider herself actively observant. One of the other committee members asked if she saw any conflict between religious belief and socialist principles. Ioana said she thought they were separate things. She said she didn't see how personal belief interfered with her work. The committee thanked her and concluded the interview. She was cleared to return to work, but Sava filed another report. This one noted that Ioana had admitted to attending church, that she had been evasive when asked about her personal beliefs, and that she appeared unable to articulate a clear commitment to socialist ideology. The report recommended continued observation and suggested that Ioana might benefit from additional ideological education. The report was added to her personnel file at the factory. A copy was forwarded to the Ministry of Internal Affairs and placed in file 1147D. Pavel Cretu reviewed the updated file in March of 1983. He noted the pattern. Multiple reports, all involving ideological concerns, all suggesting someone who was not openly defiant but also not demonstrably loyal. That category, the uncertain middle, was the most difficult to assess. He made a note in the file recommending that Ioana's housing authority be contacted to determine whether there were any other concerns. Housing authorities maintained their own records, tracking tenant behavior, complaints from neighbors, anything that might indicate instability or unreliability. The request was sent to the Chişinău Municipal Housing Office in April. The housing office reviewed their records for apartment 14B at 23 Strada Mihai Eminescu and submitted a response. The response noted that there had been no complaints about Ioana or her mother. They paid rent on time. They caused no disturbances. The apartment was well maintained. However, the report also noted that Vera Costin, Ioana's mother, had been observed receiving visits from a priest in 1981. The visits had been reported by a neighbor who noted them in a routine housing survey. The visits were not illegal, but they suggested a household with strong religious ties. Combined with Ioana's admission of church attendance, it painted a picture of someone embedded in an ideological framework inconsistent with state atheism. Cretu added this information to file 1147D. He updated the file's status from passive observation to active monitoring. This meant that Ioana would now be subject to periodic direct surveillance, not constant, but regular enough to establish a clearer picture of her activities and associations. The surveillance began in May of 1983. The surveillance was conducted by officers from the ministry's local directorate. It was not intensive. Officers were assigned to observe Ioana's movements once or twice a week, noting where she went, who she met, how long she stayed in each location. The reports were consistent. Ioana went to work. She went home. Occasionally she went to the market to buy food. Once every few weeks she attended church, always with her mother. She had no social circle that the officers could identify. She met with no one outside of work or family. The surveillance continued for 7 months. The reports accumulated in File 1147D, each one documenting the same pattern. An isolated, private individual with no apparent connections to dissidents, no contact with foreigners, no behavior that suggested active opposition to the state. But in December of 1983, one of the surveillance officers reported something different. On December 18th, Ioana was observed leaving her apartment at approximately 6:30 p.m. Instead of going to church or the market, she walked to a residential building on the other side of the city. She entered the building and remained inside for approximately 90 minutes. When she left, she was accompanied by an elderly man the officer did not recognize. The officer noted the building's address and submitted his report. CRE2 ordered a follow-up. The building was cross-referenced with housing records, and the residents were identified. The elderly man was determined to be Father Grigore Nastas, a Romanian Orthodox priest who lived in a small apartment on the building's second floor. Father Nastas was known to the ministry. He had a file, opened in 1978, documenting his activities and associations. He was not a dissident, but he was watched. Priests were always watched. The connection between Ioana and Father Nastas was noted in both files. CRE2 requested that Ioana's surveillance be increased. He wanted to know the nature of her relationship with the priest, how often they met, and what they discussed. Over the next 4 months, surveillance officers documented 6 additional meetings between Ioana and Father Nastas. All occurred at his apartment. The meetings varied in length, but most lasted between 1 and 2 hours. The officers could not record what was said inside the apartment. Surveillance at that level required authorization from higher authorities, and CRE2's requests for audio monitoring were denied. The case was not considered high priority, but the pattern was documented. In April of 1984, CRE2 submitted a formal assessment to his superiors. He noted that Ioana Dumitrescu had demonstrated a pattern of ideological unreliability spanning more than 2 years. He cited the reports from her workplace, her admission of religious belief, her regular contact with a monitored priest. He recommended that she be interviewed directly to assess whether she posed a risk to state security. The recommendation was approved. The interview was scheduled for May 22, 1984. Ioana was brought to the ministry's regional headquarters on Strada the 31st of August. She was not arrested, simply told that her presence was required for a routine security interview. She arrived at 9 a.m. and was escorted to a small office on the 3rd floor. 2 officers conducted the interview, Pavel CRE2 and a senior officer named Vasil Muntinu. The interview was recorded in written form only. No audio recording was made. The officers began by asking Ioana to confirm her personal information: name, date of birth, address, place of employment. She answered without hesitation. They asked about her work at the textile factory. They asked if she was satisfied with her position, whether she had any complaints, whether she felt she was being treated fairly. She said yes to all 3. They asked about her ideological education sessions. They noted that there had been reports of her expressing reluctance to participate. They asked if she had concerns about the content of those sessions. Ioana said no, she had no concerns. She said she understood the purpose of the sessions and respected the need for them. They asked about her religious beliefs. They asked how often she attended church, whether she considered herself a practicing believer, whether her faith influenced her views on state policies. Ioana said she attended church occasionally, primarily to accompany her mother. She said her mother was devout, but that she herself was uncertain about her beliefs. She said she didn't think her personal faith, such as it was, had any bearing on her work or her civic responsibilities. They asked about Father Nastas. They asked how she knew him, how often they met, and what they discussed. Ioana hesitated. Then she said that Father Nastas had been her mother's priest for many years. She said she'd begun visiting him in late 1983 to discuss questions she had about faith and doubt. She said the conversations were personal, not political. The officers asked what kinds of questions. Ioana said she'd been struggling with whether faith was something she genuinely believed in, or something she'd simply inherited from her mother. She said she'd wanted to talk to someone who understood those questions, someone who wouldn't judge her for asking them. The officers took notes. They asked if Father Nastas had ever discussed political matters during their conversations. They asked if he'd ever criticized the state or encouraged her to question official policies. Ioana said no. She said their conversations had been entirely about theology, about scripture, about what it meant to believe in something. The interview lasted 2 hours. At the end, the officers thanked Ioana for her cooperation and told her she was free to go. They said someone might contact her again if there were follow-up questions. Ioana left the building and returned to work. Cretu reviewed the interview notes that afternoon. He found Ioana's responses credible but not reassuring. She had admitted to ongoing contact with a priest, admitted to questioning her beliefs, admitted to private doubts. None of that was criminal, but all of it suggested someone who had not fully internalized socialist ideology. He updated file 1147D with his assessment. He recommended that surveillance continue, but that no immediate action be taken. He noted that Ioana did not appear to pose an active threat, but that her ideological reliability remained in question. The file remained open. In August of 1984, Vera Costin suffered a stroke. She was hospitalized again, this time for 5 weeks. When she was discharged in mid-September, she could no longer walk unassisted. Ioana arranged for a neighbor to check on her mother during the day while she was at work, and she adjusted her schedule to leave the factory as soon as her shift ended. The surveillance officers noted the change. They documented Ioana's daily routine: work, home, market, church. Nothing unusual. On November 12, 1984, Vera Costin died in her sleep. Ioana found her the next morning when she went to check on her before leaving for work. She called for a doctor who confirmed the death and signed the necessary paperwork. Vera was buried 3 days later in the municipal cemetery. Fewer than 10 people attended the funeral. Ioana took 1 week of bereavement leave, then returned to work. The surveillance continued. In January of 1985, Ioana stopped attending church. She also stopped visiting Father Nastas. The surveillance officers noted this in their reports but offered no explanation. Cretu reviewed the reports and flagged the change as potentially significant. In March, Ioana requested a transfer to the night shift at the factory. The request was approved. She began working 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., 6 nights a week. In May, she was observed leaving her apartment only twice outside of her work schedule, both times to buy food at the market. She spoke to no one during these trips beyond the necessary exchanges with vendors. In July, the building superintendent at 23 Strada Mihai Eminescu filed a report with the housing authority noting that Ioana had not been seen entering or leaving her apartment during daylight hours for over 2 months. The superintendent expressed concern that she might be ill or in need of assistance. The housing authority forwarded the report to the ministry. Cretu read it and noted it in the file. In September, Ioana did not report to work for 3 consecutive nights. Her supervisor at the factory called her apartment. There was no answer. He filed an absence report. On September 23, 1985, the building superintendent used his key to enter apartment 14B. He found Ioana in the bedroom. She had died several days earlier. The cause of death was determined to be an overdose of medication prescribed for anxiety. There was no note. The superintendent notified the authorities. The police filed a report. The ministry was informed. Pavel Cretu closed file 1147D on September 30, 1985. He noted the cause of death, noted that no evidence of criminal activity or security threat had been identified, and archived the file. It wasn't until 1996, 11 years after Ioana's death, that anyone examined the complete file. A historian researching religious persecution in Soviet-controlled Moldova requested access to ministry archives from the 1980s. She was given limited access to non-classified files, including 1147D. She spent 3 days reading through the surveillance reports, the workplace documents, the interview transcripts. When she finished, she wrote a brief summary for her research notes. Subject displayed no evidence of political dissent, no contact with dissidents, no anti-state activity. File appears to document a woman who asked questions about her faith and was monitored until she withdrew entirely from social contact. Surveillance ceased only upon her death. Cause of observation: uncertainty. The historian noted that similar files existed for hundreds of other individuals from the same period. Most involved people who had expressed doubt, asked questions, or failed to demonstrate sufficient ideological enthusiasm. Very few had been arrested or charged. Most had simply been watched. She included a footnote about Ioana in her published dissertation, noting that cases like hers illustrated how surveillance functioned not through enforcement, but through presence. The knowledge that one was being watched was often sufficient to produce isolation, silence, and withdrawal. No one who worked at the textile factory in the 1980s remembers Ioana clearly. Constantin Grigor retired in 1990 and died in 2004. Lydia Sava could not be located for interviews. Pavel Cretu declined to comment on specific cases when contacted in 1998. Father Grigor Nastes died in 1992. In his final years, he spoke occasionally about the people who had come to him with questions during the 1980s. He said many had stopped coming, not because they'd found answers, but because they'd realized that being seen with him carried consequences. Apartment 14B has been occupied by 3 different families since 1987. None of them know who lived there before. The file, Case 1147D, remains in the archives. It is accessible to researchers with appropriate clearance. It consists of 73 pages documenting 3 years of observation. It concludes with a single sentence: "No action required. File closed."